So, thank you. I am delighted to be here. I actually love doing this kind of session, and I'm looking forward to the one today. So, the work that Ron and Jim Motzer and the various leaders of the Planck Center do is extremely important, because I don't remember any of that existing when I was in school. If it did, I didn't get exposed to it. And I find that not only is it helpful that we see young professionals coming through and taking advantage of that, I think it's useful for all of our senior people to stay in touch and have a two-way mentoring process, which is what I find very valuable. And so I think, one of my main reflections as somebody that's been in one of these chairs, but also now on the board of advisors of the Planck Center, is a deep sense of gratitude to Betsy Planck, because she's one of the giants of this business in life, but her legacy is so important now, and it lives on through this foundation and through the Planck Center. And I think it's really taken what a lot of us were doing informally and turned it into a much more robust mission, which is trying to connect with you, not only to share some of the experiences we have, but to encourage you to think more broadly and try new things, because there's so much change happening in the world, as we just saw this week, but in our business too. And in fact, a lot of this change you saw in this election cycle was related to things we're seeing changing in the communications business. And whenever it's that kind of change, that's opportunity. And I think it's especially important to come and take advantage of organizations like this. So Betsy was a giant in the business, but I'm also honored to be here with other giants in the business, and that's one of the great things about the Planck Center. They recognize people that have really contributed so much over the years, and I would encourage you today, I hope this will be a useful discussion, but a lot of the value will be what happens afterwards. And for those who follow up, if you follow up, I think you're going to find people are very responsive, and it's going to be helpful. And I think it's something that we all encourage. So the other part I just want to make is when there are opportunities like this, and as you go through these various programs, not only with the Planck Center, but with PRSSA and these other great organizations, it's important to know how to recognize these opportunities and what to do with them. And I think that's part of where, as you reach out to mentors and mentors at all levels, think about that, not only specific help with steps you're taking, but how to recognize what is an opportunity, because they don't come wrapped in a box and they don't come with instructions. They often are not always easy to recognize, and sometimes they take courage, they take ingenuity, they take enterprise, and I think they take a willingness to take risks. And I think once you do that, you're going to find the results will be amazing. So the other part I would just say is that remember that mentoring takes many forms, and as you take advantage of a situation like this and connect with these mentors, remember that it's a two-way process. And so I think your perspective at this point in your life and where you are in terms of your sophistication on digital and social elements is going to be just as valuable to the people that you're dealing with too. So I think as you're looking for these opportunities, look for ways that you can also stand out, because what we're talking about here is a personal brand. You have your brand just like a company has their product brands. And over the years, we've done a lot of research on what constitutes brand strength. And interestingly, it's not really as much about awareness or even esteem. It's about two big elements: differentiation. What's exceptional about this? How is this different from all the other things I see? And relevance. So what's different about it, and why does it matter to me? So as you're thinking about your personal brand, this is what you want to try and do. Demonstrate what's different. What are you bringing to the table? If you got a mundane task to do, what's another way to invent that, so that you stand out and make a difference. And I think, and if there are any ways we can help, we are eager to do so. And so let's start with that. I'm going to ask Jada Culver to come up, and oh, here you are. And Jada is going to start the questions. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Pat, for speaking with us today. We appreciate that. So today I have the lovely opportunity to question Miss Amar Hines with us today. And if you don't know about her, she's receiving an award tonight, and she's the CEO of Tech's 100 Global Communications. So starting off with our first question for you. As a CEO of one of the largest digital public relation firms in the world, and serving clients that use technology as a competitive advantage, how do you see cybersecurity affecting the PR profession and the work that we do?
Whoa, that's a big question. Well, I think that what cybersecurity has done in terms of communications, and particularly within major corporations, is put right at the top of the board agenda the issue of protecting data and keeping information secure. And so as a result of that, I think what we are finding is that executives are paying much closer attention to it as an issue, and as a result, putting a lot more thought into their entire, everything from their crisis communications plan right through to how do they deal with any cyber security issues that they may encounter, and how do they as a brand want to be able to at the very earliest stage, recognize what's happening and protect their brand and their customers. So I think as a result of this as an issue, it's just become so much more of a prominent position for executives at the top of the boardroom. So I think in some ways, even though I hate to say it because it's more of a negative, it has become for the communications industry something of a lever to ensure that all executives are paying very close attention to their strategy around social, digital, and communications.
Does anyone else on the panel have to add anything to that?
Well, I would just point out what just happened in this election with WikiLeaks, among other things. I think the notion of remembering that anything you do online is on there and is discoverable in one way or another. And second, I think companies are becoming much more conscious of this, but document control and the security of various elements is just extremely important. And I think it's as we go along here, it's only going to become more important.
Thank you. All right, for the second question, what is an emerging technology that you find exciting and impactful upon the public relations industry today?
Sorry, and
what is an emerging digital technology that you find exciting and impactful upon the PR industry today?
In the old days, we got the questions in advance. We didn't get them.
Take your time, take your time.
I think for me, the thing that's having the greatest impact in terms of communications and the thing that's transforming our world, if you were to step beyond social and digital, it would be the use of analytics and big data. For me, the fact that today I can determine with a huge amount of clarity and precision people's behavior and what they're doing online in a way that I can target them, where 10 years ago we were talking about demographics. We would look at you and we would put you into a bunch of different segments and say, right, students, female, gender, persuasion, where you come from, but we put you into large groups. Whereas today, the kind of analytics that technology, and there are many different forms, from what's free, through Google, or what, lots of our clients pay huge amounts of money to get the precise information about you as an individual. So no matter what you do online, we're able to target you in a way that we never could before. That to me probably is the most transformative part, if you were to just say what goes beyond social and digital. But I think it's also kind of scary, you go back to the cybersecurity part of it. But I think increasingly that's going to make our work so much more interesting, because now we're going to be able to target people, and not even in close proximity, but people at the other side of the world who just happen to share a common view or a common perspective, with people, in different walks of life. And for me, that's fascinating because now it really goes to the heart of how you develop a strategy. So that would be the big technology and the big evolution that I feel is going to change communications in a major way.
And speaking of the targeting, at JPMorgan Chase, we have these heat maps that we have in public relations, but also customer service, where anytime people are saying bad things about us or a product or service they receive anywhere in the country, and to a less extent around the world, but anywhere in the country, we see that early. We try to see it before somebody complains to a journalist or somebody talks to a regulator, calls Elizabeth Warren, and we try to actually, no, but true. And so we've got these heat maps, and we dive in and talk to these people directly at the moment we see a problem happening. We saw that they were protesting, a loan to a pipeline last week, and we got to that early. And we also saw that somebody was mad at their ATM fees, and we got to that early. But the technology is great to find these problems early.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I contribute to that?
Absolutely.
I mean, I know that people heaped a lot of scorn on Pokemon Go when it came out, but I do think it's remarkable that within 48 hours it became a larger company than Twitter. And so we live in a world now where a good piece of technology can completely transform the landscape quickly. And it had a lot of appeal because it introduced, I think, so many people to this concept of augmented reality, that the world in which we live is actually not the world in which we live, that there is something happening deeper all around us. And I think that that will allow us in the future to be able to completely change the way that we interact with the world. And I remember going out 2 days after Pokemon Go came out. I went for 3 hours to just check it out. And there were hundreds of people walking around, talking, looking at stupid things. And I think that augmented reality has sort of begun to emerge and will be a hugely transformative technology on the scale of the internet.
Thank you. All right, our last question. So, Ms. Hines, as you are with your job, you obviously coach a lot of client executives. And so when you're talking to your client executives about diversity and inclusion efforts, how do you get that conversation started, and what obstacles do you commonly see when you're talking about diversity and inclusion?
Well, how I got that conversation started is probably the same way that you get any conversation started, in that, for me, the best client and executive relationships I have are the ones where you take the time to know them and build up a level of trust, where you can enter into subjects and enter into discussions on issues that sometimes can be sensitive, but as a good consultant, you've got to be able to have them. So for me, it's always that ability to build a trusted relationship with your clients. I think increasingly, the issues around diversity and inclusion, again, have become, at least in the last 5 years, I would say, so much more a subject that I think that every brand is thinking about. There are so few that are not. That it becomes a lot easier. And, in many respects, I would say I find that executives are bringing it up with us. And I'm certainly seeing increasingly that clients are requiring that their agencies have a policy in place and that they are representative as much of the audiences that they're trying to communicate with. Because I think that's the biggest issue right now. To be effective, you need to understand. So you need, and I think, that this was my take, not that I want to make this political in any way, but as a result of the election, I felt coming out of the election and the surprise that we had that 50% of this country were so polarized. It made me feel as though, as a communications leader, do we fully understand our audiences in this country if we could be so taken aback by an outcome which was clearly 50% support of somebody whose views are different to mine? So, for that reason, I think to be in communications, it behooves us at the most fundamental level to put ourselves out there and ensure that we are fully versed as best we can in understanding as many walks of life and as many different points of view as possible. Again, I talking to an executive is just one part of it. I think it behooves us all to be in a position to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Did anyone else?
No, just thinking, who would have thought that there's California and New York, and then if you want to understand diversity, you have to understand the whole middle of the country, because I mean, you see the New York Times and all the networks, they all just miss the rest of the country.
Awesome. Well, thank you so
Well,
much.
if I could, because I'm kind of passionate about this, we're putting a lot of attention, we public relations profession, on diversity and inclusion now, and I think a couple of key points. It's about much more than just recruiting or creating opportunities. I think the notion of inclusion has to do with a whole lot of things about the workplace, and so part of what we're doing is trying to make our discussions around that tied to the business and tied to how that really relates. Number two, we're trying to do a lot of listening, and we've got various forms of that in terms of diversity councils, but also employee resource groups that talk about things that matter. A number of our young professionals came to me a few weeks ago and said, we're here 10 hours a day, and yet there's some things happening right now in this society that really affects us and that we're thinking about all the time and that we talk about with our families, but we never talk about it here. And that was a good point. And so we actually set up a really fascinating webinar for a whole U.S. network just on the subject of race and policing, and not trying to draw any big conclusions, just creating more dialogue. And I think, I was one of the judges for the diversity awards that PR Council and PR Week did this year, and it was interesting to see how some of these initiatives are coming about. Edelman has some really good initiatives with their employee resource groups. They have one for LGBTQ called Equal that did a lot of volunteering around after Orlando and did pro bono work with some of the groups that were helping the community there. They also have an affinity group for their African American employees called GRIO. Same idea. After some of the things that happened in Dallas and Minnesota and elsewhere, they brought those groups together and started working on some tangible things that they, at different levels of their company, could do. And then the one other one I was going to mention is Ketchum has developed an app for part of their recruitment that is set up to basically address unconscious bias. So in other words, everybody takes the same test, and when they look at these scores, before they talk to you, before they look at the scores, they don't know what school you came out of, what community you grew up in, how much money your parents have. They're just looking at how you responded to that. And then you start the process. But what they found is a lot more quality candidates really doing fantastic work on their fellowships. So I think a lot of us are looking at those best practices and really trying to learn from them and build on them.
Now, business resource groups of the companies, before it used to be LG, then it was LGBT, then it's LGBTQ, and then it just keeps going. So we're drilling down, and it's amazing how the new generation of recruits that we get, they're the first questions we get are, how do you treat people? What is the diversity of the company? Are you giving back to the community? What's your views on the environment? Before it used to be, what am I being paid and what is my job going to be? And it's a completely different discussion when students come in and look for jobs now.
Well, thank you again for answering my questions. Next, I'm going to introduce Jacob from Loyola University. Got it. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jacob Voss. I'm president of the Loyola PSSA Society here in Chicago. And I have the opportunity today of introducing Joe Evangelisti.
Pretty close.
Correct?
Evangelisti.
Evangelisti, close. Who is head of worldwide corporate communications and media relations at JP Chase. Now, before we get started, I have a really important reminder. Take out your phones and take a picture of these wonderful people up here and tweet it at Plank Mentor.
Can I fix my tie first?
Yes, fix the tie. All right, so don't forget to do that. All right, so let's get started. The first question that I have it pertains to students and seasoned professionals of all kinds. In the communications industry nowadays, it is increasingly important to have a smart business sense. So I'm curious, I've been looking over your bio and you have a lot of business sense, it seems. And I'm curious where you think you got that business sense. Was it in school? Was it through doing the work that you do? And if you are a communications professional and you don't have that sense of business, how can you go about doing that?
So I started at, first of all, I'm so happy I finally got into DePaul, which is great. So, I started 31 years ago at JP Morgan Chase, and I wanted to be a journalist. And I was the editor of my school newspaper in college, and I wanted to find a writing job in New York, and there weren't writing jobs in 1985. And I took another job, which we won't detour into. I was the assistant buyer of pantyhose at Lord & Taylor. Assistant buyer, yes. I love your hosiery chair. But then I went straight to JP Morgan and wanted to be a reporter. So I worked on the daily newsletters. I worked on the reports to the board of directors. I worked on the the monthly newspaper, so on and so forth, because I went in there as a reporter, which ended up being good training for a public relations job, because if any of you speak to journalists, and when we have in our jobs, they can tell when you don't respect them. They can tell when you don't understand what they need. They can tell if you're talking down to them. They can tell if you're misleading them. You really have to have a sense of what they need and where they're coming from too. So having that reporter background was good for me. And then I used it, quite frankly. I don't think, you can do public relations for Giorgio Armani, or for a television network, or for a pharmaceutical company, or a tech company, or financial, or the Pope. And you can do this, and it's still the same skills. Find out what the story is, get all the facts, tell the story well, educate people, respond, and you just learn. So so I learned business through osmosis and through asking questions for all those years.
Okay. Does any other panelists have input? All right.
I did a project a few years ago for the Page Society where I interviewed about a dozen or 15 of the really iconic chief communications officers at Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, IBM, a number of others, and was asking them, and they all were renowned for having a place at the table, which is what everybody wants. And I was asking them why are they, what do they think are the key factors that gets them respected in the C-suite? And to a person, it was their knowledge of business and of their company's business. In other words, it wasn't how great they wrote a press release, it was business. And one of them talked about how he had spent a year early in his career at Owens Corning, actually in a line job in one of the factories, and he thought it was a detour at the time. Now he thinks it was one of the most valuable things because he got to know the business. And I think I was with a group of senior communications people recently. We were going around the table. What advice would we give to ourselves as a entering freshman in college? And mine was, I wish I took more business and economics courses. I thought I wanted to be a reporter. I took, political science and journalism courses. I wish I had more founding in business, and I would encourage you to do that.
I would say the other thing as well, though, is that I encourage people to read the newspapers, and I know that's probably the wrong thing to say, but get an online subscription to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times and force yourself to read outside the scope of what you're just interested in. You should have a perspective on politics. You should have a perspective on world affairs. You should understand what's driving markets and the performances of business. So while if we don't always get the advantage to have an economics or a financial degree or whatever, I think you pick up so much by just reading what companies are doing. And I think, going back to your question about how do you advise an executive, if you're ever in a situation that you're in a room with an executive, you have to have something more to talk to them about than communications, because honestly, it will be a short conversation, not because of your perspective, but because executives don't normally know an awful lot about communications, but they do know about politics, they do know about world affairs, they do know about business. You need to be able to hold your own in that conversation. So I would say just make sure you're reading as much as you possibly can.
I'd echo that too, and I think we know this from social media. There's a premium on being an interesting person, and if you're only good at what you do and nothing else, then you're probably not all that interesting.
All right.
Great quote.
Great.
Tweet that.
Tweet it. All right. So, Joe, you mentioned storytelling in your last answer. So I would actually like to expand a little bit on that. In order to effectively tell a story and define your brand, how are you using that tool nowadays of storytelling? And how do you resonate with your audience through the art of storytelling?
Well, we have a challenge because as of a couple weeks ago, we're the biggest bank in the world, and big banks are not loved right now. Mm-hmm. And when I, 10 or 15 years ago, when I was trying to get publicity and good stories about our company, I would have thought, well, if our stock is at an all-time high, and if in the rankings and products we're number 1, 2, or 3, and if customer service is very high, and if the company is making more money than ever, we would have gotten very positive stories. We would have been on the cover of Fortune and Forbes and everything. Now, the questions are you good? Are you decent? Are you too big? Do you give back? Are you part of the solution? Do you care? Are you honest? And so my department, for those, I call it lowercase CR, lowercase corporate responsibility. My group of people for that is bigger than my group of people for the investment bank, for the credit card company, which is the biggest credit card company in America, for the retail, for the asset management. I'm spending more time on that. So the stories we're telling right now, and we have to back it up with reality, you just can't make up these things, but like all companies, we do a lot of good things. Every time I put my CEO on television or in a newspaper or in front of a group where something will be public, they have to start with it's sort of statesman-like. How are we giving back? We're doing this for Detroit, or we have a new environmental policy, or we donated to X, Y, or Z, or we're doing training for kids, and so on and so forth. So those are the stories that we're telling now, and then we layer them over, and our businesses, which do X, Y, and Z, are supporting this good work. But it's been a complete reversal from 15 years ago. I think that's more for banks. I can't see it maybe for General Motors. General Motors has the best car and the highest profits. They'll probably still get good press. But for big institutions like banks, Wall Street, government, which have their lowest reputations ever, this is the way you can win back that trust, but step by step.
Do any of the other panelists have remarks about how you can use storytelling? All right, perfect. Well, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, the media landscape has changed tremendously, and I think banks and politicians and foundations, many of the larger institutions in society now are put into narratives of conflict and competition, and so it's less sexy to write about a foundation revitalizing a neighborhood or immunizing 1 million people against polio. Or helping, a few million people to buy homes. And I think that's a bit of a shame, and it's hard to get these positive stories to get attention from others. And so, you have to engage with the public in a way that allows you to put your story into these other stories.
The one point I would add there is great corporate messages have to go beyond just the information. So they've got to be information. They've got to say what that company's doing, but they've got to be inspirational. I mean, there's got to be something that's connecting that company to the community in the way you were talking about. And then they've got to be aspirational. Like where is this business going? Right now, we do a lot of work with Ford Motor Company. They're not talking about making cars, right? I mean, they talk about that, but they're talking about mobility. They're talking about smart mobility, which is not only about autonomous vehicles, it's about how the world is going to change in terms of its ownership of vehicles in the next 10 or 15 years. And there are so many companies and so many businesses you need to be changing constantly, and you need to be steering your own team, but also your community and your overall ecosystem toward where you think you're going to be going. And that's extremely important, and really that's what's embedded in storytelling.
All right. I think we have time for one more quick question. As lead spokesperson for JP Morgan Chase, how do you prepare for those tough interviews when you do have a crisis on the table? And how do you kind of cover yourself and the company while maintaining your moral standards?
Well, the first thing, one of the panelists talked about seat at the table. You need a seat at the table. You have to be in the middle of those conversations. You can't be the second-class PR person over there that gets a translated version of reality. You have to make sure that people are telling you the truth, telling you mostly in real time, so that you know all the facts. Then you have to really nail the facts down. You have to be able to defend them. If it's bad, you have to plead guilty on day one. You have to say what it is and then talk about your plan to get better. I've found that some companies in bad times, that's the time the PR department slams the door, hangs up on the journalist, asks for a correction in a newspaper, lies or misleads, which is a no-no for ethical reasons and professional reasons, or gets misled by their managers. You can't do that. The journalists all remember, the publications remember, and they don't give you the benefit of the doubt. So it really is having the seat at the table, getting the facts, and then giving it straight. When the lawyers jump in and try to tell you, you can't say this, or you can't say that, or you can't say that, you really have to push back. Another big bank, they had a hearing a few weeks ago, and they weren't supposed to talk about issues like clawbacks or about saying they were wrong, I'm sure, based on legal advice. And that hurts, because you're eventually going to be getting this news out, and you're delaying it, and you're causing distrust. So it's got to be very straightforward, and you gain in the long term for that.
All right. Any other comments regarding that topic? All right, we are going to move on. So I'm going to introduce Andrea Feketin from North Central University.
Thanks, Jacob. Hello, everyone. I hope we're all having a good day so far. So today I am going to ask some questions to the incredible Pat Ford, as most of us know, who is the Worldwide Vice Chair and Chief Client Officer at Burson Marsteller. So my first question is, a few months ago, you were named the Diversity Champion in the PR Agency category for the 2016 Diversity Distinction in PR Awards. What steps have you taken to create an environment within Burson Marsteller that is so welcoming to a diverse talent?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm very passionate about this topic. I think there are several things. First of all, we've set up a lot of forums for dialogue on issues that matter. We've done training on diversity and inclusion, which helps not only with just building more awareness about what that means, but also just expanding people's thoughts about it. And I wanted to describe a situation that happened several years ago. We were doing one of these training programs, and part of what the trainer did was she had posters all around the room with verbatim comments, bad comments, that were made about different individuals. And so there were actually two posters for women. There was one for African Americans, there was one for Latino, there was one for Asian American, and one for LGBTQ. And in fact, when she was doing it, I asked her to make sure that where they could, they included at least one quote from the Burson focus groups they did, because I wanted to make sure it was relevant. And so the idea was they did this, and we went through and I talked about that, and then she gave everybody two sets of dots. Red dots, put the three red dots, put them where somebody's actually said this to you. And then the yellow dots, I gave you three yellow dots, put this where you've seen somebody or heard somebody saying this kind of thing. So we got going, and as you can imagine, there was a buzz in the room. Everybody's going around. And she came over to me because I was standing in the middle of the room with a kind of far-off look. And she said, "You look troubled." And I said, "Well, my problem is I don't have any place to deploy my dots." And when she brought the room back together, we figured it out. I actually never did deploy the red dots. But when she came back, she said, "I hope Pat's not going to mind this, but I want to tell everybody what just happened here." So this older Caucasian male is looking around the room, and nobody's ever said any of these things to him. And, it's really important that we understand that our perceptions of how things work are so much different. So much different. And I think part of what we're trying to do is build more understanding around that, around all kinds of diversity. By the way, a learning for me was about generational diversity. And, surprisingly enough, Gen Xers and millennials don't actually look at things exactly like us old baby boomers do. And we need to respect that. We need to understand and respect that, because really what we're really talking about with diversity and inclusion is building awareness and levels of respect. And so that, I think, is where we start and proceed.
Okay, great. Thank you. My second question for you. In 2014, you were awarded the Milestones in Mentoring Legacy Award from the Planck Center for Leadership and Public Relations. What is the most important piece of advice you have given to your mentees over the course of your career thus far?
I probably spend too much time, as you can tell today, I can be loquacious, and I probably spend too much time giving advice. But
You get a lot of awards.
Pretty impressive.
That's okay. So I think, maybe I would pick two. And interestingly enough, they both came from my grandmother. And one of them was that I think about almost every day, which is, if you want to have a friend, you got to be a friend. And that means if you want to get ahead in a business, you got to be helpful to other people in that business. If you want to, if you're a company and you want the community to trust you and have all those things that Joe was talking about, it can't be lip service. You got to be a friend. You got to be really listening and engaging with all of those stakeholders, whether they're employees, communities where you operate, investors, customers. And then the second piece of advice was, I maybe rephrased it a little bit, which is, if you don't like the answer, change the question. Too often we get bogged down in, why something is unfair or why a situation isn't what we expected it to be or it shouldn't be. Just reframe it, and you've still got to face whatever that issue is, but put it in a way that you can take some action on, and you'd be surprised over the years how I've seen and how I've experienced what you can do if you just look around the corner and figure out another way to perceive that. And I think, I don't want to put her on the spot, but I think Admar is like one of the real all-time greats at that. Their company has done so many things beyond what is expected. And I think that's because they changed the question.
Do any of the other panelists have any advice that they would like to share with the audience? Nothing in particular? Okay, that's fine. Moving on to my third question for Pat. Can you share with us one of your most memorable moments from mentoring?
So I would say I've had a lot of them, but I guess I would talk about not so much the mentoring thing itself, but I was having dinner recently with a person who was our CEO of our firm back in the early 90s. And when he became the CEO, he had been based in Europe, and they moved him back to New York. And he was kind enough to invite me out to lunch and ask me what I thought he should be focusing on and what I thought the firm should be doing. So this was a couple years ago, and I said to him, we were sitting at a restaurant there in New York. I said, you may not remember this, but in the spring of 1992, you came back, you invited me to lunch. We ate at Bobby Flay's Mesa Grill down the street, and I described to him basically what we talked about in that lunch period. And I said, my guess is that you don't even remember that lunch. And he kind of laughed and said, actually, I don't. And I said, well, you know what? I don't take that personally. But what I think about every day is that, at that point, I was 38 years old. I was an EVP at Burson. I was 41 years old. I was an EVP at Burson. I had been the head of external affairs at a major think tank. In other words, I was a fully formed professional. And yet I remember him taking that time and really seeming to want to hear what I said. And I remember that whole freaking conversation. I can remember specific conversations I had with an editor in Hoboken 40 years ago, or others who just took some time and showed they cared about me and about my career. And what I try to do every day is to keep that in mind. The interaction you and I had earlier, or when we talk after this, I want you to think that was a helpful thing, and if to the extent I can get through a week and have people feel I had a few of those, that's a good week for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce the next student speaker, who is Lori Vasquez from Indiana University Northwest.
Why are the students better dressed than we are? I mean, you have no budget at all, do you? Sorry, not you. You look at
Hello, everyone. Okay, so today I'm interviewing Jesse Salazar. He is the Vice President of Content Design for the Council on Foundations. So my first question for you, what was the most useful tool or piece of information you used yourself to be in the position that you are in today?
So when I got my first VP job at the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, I had an actual plaque over my department that said JFGI. Which stands for Just Fucking Google It.
Cut.
So JFGI is the most important thing you will ever know as a communications professional. There is all sorts of information on Google, and if you just keep on clicking, you will find so much rich information. And if you are going in to meet with someone, if you're going to talk about some important topic, you should do everything you can to know something about that topic. And Google makes that accessible. So, JFGI.
Does anyone else have anything to add?
What more can you say?
Okay.
That was sort of a drop the mic.
Yeah. So for our second question, as young professionals, how should we expect the industry to change by the time we begin our own entry-level positions?
I would say the change is a constant thing. So my first real communications job was on the presidential transition team. I got sort of allocated to the communications team when I didn't really have very much experience in communications. And I was given what at the time was a fairly menial task doing Facebook and YouTube. And I just jumped in and tried to learn everything I could about Facebook and YouTube. And obviously it turned out that was a pretty valuable set of skills to have had, but I remember just a few months after that, Twitter came out, and suddenly I felt like a complete dinosaur because there was this whole new platform that had a whole new way of speaking that I just didn't know. And so what I would say is that when something silly like Pokemon Go comes out and hundreds of millions of people start using it, go out of your comfort zone, try it out, spend some time on it. I'm Snapchatting now, which I didn't think I'd ever do. And I've become addicted to Reddit, I think, like a lot of people younger than me.
All right. And for our last question, as a young professional first starting out, what is the best advice you can give us in regards to saving our earnings the first few years we are working?
As somebody who lived most of my early life in horrible debt, I don't think I'm the best person for this. But what I would say is that that's okay. I mean, I took huge student loans and then decided to go to grad school, which probably wasn't a good financial decision. But I'll tell you that financial desperation as a young person opened up the world of communications to me. So I was studying to be a historian, and I got this opportunity to write a speech. And somebody said, "We'll give you $5,000 to write this speech." And I remember saying, "I don't care what this speech is about. I'm going to write the best speech I can." And it completely changed my world because I realized that was a skill that I didn't have. But I needed to figure out how to write that speech in order to get that $5,000 because I needed the money. And I think that's okay. And I'll tell you that there have been these moments in my life where I've really felt destitute. And then there have been these moments in my life where someone will come and say, I will give you way more money to do this job than you ever thought you were going to earn. And that has been delightful. And I think that if you really love the job that you're doing and are really passionate about it, then money will come. And I know that's cliche, but I really think
money
it's true.
does come in these jobs, especially in communications, which has moved up in importance in organizations. And so you're just going to have to, for your first few years, know it's going to be a little more painful. But if you stick with what you do and you're at a good organization, it comes and it's worth it. And those student loans look smaller and smaller and smaller.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Now I would like to introduce Shantae Howell, the president of DePaul PRSSA.
Hello, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for coming out again today and for our awesome panelists. And again, Pat Ford, it is great to see you for the second year in a row for me personally. We are going to open up the floor to questions. So if anyone wants to ask one or all of our speakers anything, go ahead and throw up your hands and I'll call you out. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sunny Franks from the University of Alabama. I mean, I guess it's obvious to all of us that you all care about mentorship. That's why you're here. But one thing that really caught my attention was when Mr. Ford specifically mentioned that he didn't have a program like this when he was in school. That mentorship was not something focused on, I think, as like a structured thing. And so I'm very interested because obviously you did end up being an incredible mentor to many. What experience did you have with mentorship? What is your earliest mentor experience? And I would love to hear from all of you. Thank you, Blake.
So can I just start out by saying I love your Twitter feeds, and I love to retweet you. When I saw you when you came in, I was going to make a beeline over to you at the end of this. One of the most valuable early things for me is I had a professor at Rutgers who really seemed to take an interest in me, and I really appreciate it. I had started out college in 1969 when there was no Twitter and when there was a lot of fun and there was a student strike that closed down our school and et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't really take it seriously for a little while. But I had no money. My parents had no money. I had to quit for a little while to sell women's shoes, by the way. And when I went back, I really valued that. And the first semester I was back, I had a professor. I don't know if he could tell that or just took pity on me or whatever, but he really took me under his wing. It was political science, but he became my advisor. And I think what I learned from him was that notion of to be constantly probing and asking questions. He just pushed us to keep going beyond whatever he was talking about in the class, and he would actually sort of single out on your blue books if you pulled out something that was beyond what was in the book or what was in the class. And so I think for that and a lot of others, they were more informal mentoring things. I mentioned this editor that I worked with who really taught me about taking care with language and about being precise. And I think whatever you're doing, I think you've got to read constantly, as Admar talked about, and you got to write. You got to keep writing and trying to do new kinds of writing. So I would say some of those early things inspired me. And then the last one was my first boss in Washington he used to have a traffic issue. So he'd be around, I knew he'd be around the office at the end of the day. And almost every day I would go in his office and he would spend an amazing amount of time with me, teaching me about Washington, teaching me about PR, which I knew nothing about. But more important, teaching me how to be a good person. He had such grace and generosity in that, it's what I've tried to emulate for my whole life.
And following up on what you said, one thing that never works with me is if somebody calls me up or knocks on the door and says, "Can you be my mentor? And can we have lunch every 6 or 8 weeks?" That's so unnatural to me, and it doesn't usually lead to success, especially if you don't know this person well. It really has to evolve in terms of you seeking out information, you building relationships with those people wanting to share information with you, taking you under their wing, teaching you. And you can have a lot of those types of people throughout your career that aren't the once every 6 week lunches, but are just real life, real time experiences.
It's always interesting to see who just sort of jumps out, right? And it's usually that. It's usually because they come and ask some interesting, insightful question. And we had an intern class a few years ago where this young woman, after I spoke with the interns, she sent a note, "Can I come by for 10 minutes? I've just got to ask a question." And do I really think she needed, I forget what the question was now, but do I really think that was it about? What she figured out was the way to get that started was to ask me about something that I cared about that she could have an effect on. And it ended up being a little more than 10 minutes, 20 minutes or something. But for the rest of that summer, I knew who this person was, and I was watching out for her. At the end of that summer, the group she was in didn't have a spot for her, so we found a spot for her. And she did great, and then she went and got her master's at Wharton, and now she's one of the right-hand people to Sheryl Sandberg at the Lean In Foundation. And she's phenomenal. And every step of the way, she figured out a way to stand out.
I think we had one in the front here.
So you guys are very, accomplished within your lives as well as stuff too. You even made a joke that Mr. Pat Ford's always winning an award every so often.
Actually, it's Ms. Hines.
Our life always expresses the result of our dominant thoughts. So how do you feel like you guys' accomplishments throughout your lives and what you've done, even something like this, really reflects what you believe in, what you think in? Like, how do you feel that what your success has reflected towards? Like, do you feel it's accurately expressed what you feel and think? It's just a general one for everyone.
I'll have a think about it.
Okay. One thing that I always say to people in my group is I say, we're not bringing peace to the Middle East, and we're not curing cancer. We're doing PR for a bank. So remember that you're here. You should do your best. You should try yourself. You should serve the company honorably. Be fair to everybody. But you have a life outside of here, and that you're not going to succeed in the workplace if you're not succeeding outside of it, if you're not taking care of your health, if you're not spending time with loved ones and so on and so forth. So I have to say that part of, I think, my longevity here has been that insistence on balance. I mean, my CEO knows he cannot call me before 8 a.m. because I say, you either have me before 8 a.m. or after 6 p.m., but not both. Right, and you train these people but it's not just about hours. It's just about having that balance in life, and if you're a healthier, better person with more interests and more knowledge, and you're more relaxed, you're going to do a better job. And so that's a semi-answer to your question.
So it's a great question, and I wanted just to pause for a minute to think about it because it's a huge question, right? It's sort of the meaning of life type of question. And so for me, one of the things, and I think my experience in life has made me feel is that, I'm somewhat fatalistic, and I feel every day needs to be a great day because I may not be here tomorrow. And I don't mean that in some melancholy way, but it's been one part of my life that's been important to me. And if I think about what I've achieved in my life and the business I've grown, I don't think I was ever trying to grow a fantastic PR agency. I wanted to create a place where people could come together and really enjoy what they were doing. So, while communications was interesting to me, it was much more about could I build a business that had a culture and a set of values that reflected what I believed in, and therefore I would attract people who had similar values to me. And it was a lot about, a sense of team and people who cared about each other, that were going to encourage each other, and we're going to work really hard but play really hard too. And so as the business grew, I found that over time more people began to take those values and that sentiment and replicate it across the world. And so for me, it's really just that notion that you have to build an environment where you can be the same person at home as you are in the workplace. When you have to bifurcate those two things and you have to enter into a work culture that's so alien to what your values are yourself, then that's not a good place to be. So I think by building a company, for me, I wanted it to reflect how I felt about the colleagues I work with, is the same way as I reflect about the people I'm at home with. I want it all to feel like as if it's a good place to be with strong values and a strong culture. So that was something of my raison d'etre. So when I look back, I think, yeah, if it represents that and the people who work in the company feel that, then that was a good achievement.
And you've done it. I know a good number of people who work now or have worked at her company, and it's clear that has had that effect. It's really admirable. Do you want to go next?
Sure. I would say that the hardest thing in life is to live a lie. And I think that it is so important that you be able to be yourself at whatever it is that you're doing. So for me, I wake up every day thrilled that I get to do something I love. I feel like I won the lottery, that I have had just lots of fortunate opportunities throughout my life. And so I also, at the same time, feel like because I have been so lucky, I have a moral responsibility to give back to others and to spend my days helping other people so that they don't have to live lies. I also believe that I have had people come to me and say, you could do more than what you're doing right now, and you need to do that. And it's very easy to be comfortable, but you owe it to yourself to try to do stuff that's hard. And so in philanthropy, we are trying to do things like cure cancer and fix the broken criminal justice system. And when you get into a room and someone says, okay, so how do we respond to the results of this election as a sector? You have to have some thought about that. But hopefully you'll have a real moral vision for what you think people need. And I believe, for me, that moral vision begins with being able to live a true life, an authentic life.
I think for me, and some of my mentees in the room have heard me say this, I think one of the most important things, and one of the things I've always tried to do, is be present. Wherever I was, be there, and be there completely. And it gets harder and harder with all the distractions and the devices and so on. And as I mentioned to some colleagues recently, I see people pulling out their phones or doing various distractions when they're in conversations. And I've got to say, I've never, in all my years in this business, I've never done that when I'm with a client or with a colleague at whatever level they are. I never pick up the phone when I'm talking to somebody. And I'll tell you who else I've never seen do that. I've never seen any CEO I know, or COO, or CFO, or Harold Burson, or the people that I really see as leaders. I never see them on their devices when we're in meetings. And I think it's important as you go along for in life, but also in business. You've got to be able to concentrate. Part of it is being able to get off the grid a little bit, but it's also wherever you are on that grid, be there. And the other things will take and manage them so the other things can take care of themselves. But one of the ways you make people know you care is you listen and you're there.
Lauren?
With the with our news cycle and then the constant change that is happening within our industry, how do you guys keep up with different news sites? Do you use? Do you have a favorite app, favorite author you like to read, anything like that?
I talk to peers. I mean, I sort of acknowledge that I can't possibly know all the things that I need to know right now, and so I really rely on colleagues to tell me what's interesting, what's hip, So just last night, for example, I had a call with a bunch of communications folks, and I said, okay, how do we understand this other half of the population? And the wisdom of this 10-person group gave me a book list of 5 that I could source for more information.
For me, it's not new, but my aggregator is Twitter. So a lot of the sites that I used to go to for news, now I'm following them on Twitter and I'm reading their feeds, and it's both a good thing and a bad thing. But as news is being developed now in this cycle, there's a need for those. There's a need for speed, and it gets greater all the time. And so they've got to be out there all the time, and they got to be getting clicks. So you can work your way through a whole lot of headlines, if you will, and then be able to click where you need to. And so there are a few publications, and I think Admar referred to some of them, that we all pay a lot of attention to: the Times, the Journal, the Financial Times in Washington, well, even beyond Washington, the Washington Post, but also other aggregator sites and other more focused sites that I think that's one of the really exciting things about the business today is you used to have to go and really hunt something down, and you still do, but it's so many more sources for it.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, I think the most immediate source for me is Twitter, just simply because of the fact that it's such a great aggregator of other information. It's fast, it's quick, and it helps with breaking news. But when I came to live in the US first, what I was fascinated by was the way news is delivered, because here you start with local and then you sort of move to regional and then to national and then global, whereas if you grow up in Europe, you tend to start with global issues because they're usually far more interesting than what's happening in Ireland, let's be honest. But as a result of that, I found that I had to dig deeper and deeper to get to the stories I needed to. And one of the very small things I did was, whenever my children were allowed to have access to a computer, I would insist that when they opened their homepage was the BBC, only because it forced them to read stuff that perhaps they wouldn't read on social media. So small things like that, just to make sure that you're sourcing your news from sources that are outside what your echo chamber is. Just going back to the point I made earlier, we are so much in a bubble, and sometimes Facebook and Twitter and our friends are feeding us what we already think, and that really worries me. It worries me for me, but it also worries me for you and for a new generation who have access to a lot of people who reinforce their points of view already. Got to get outside that and try and find, be willing to listen to other people's point of view, and that's not going to come from your echo chamber.
I DVR the BBC, World News America, the Caddy K thing every day. I mean, every day. That is so much more valuable than, and basically stay away from the 24-hour cable things. They're not real. It's not life. Every once in a while, my wife gets really anxiety-ridden about one thing or another. I just say, turn off CNN or whatever it is she's watching, because that's not life. But BBC actually usually is.
Yeah.
Krista, did I see you with a question?
So my name's Krista. I'm a junior at Loyola Chicago. And kind of going back to mentorship, Betsy Plank said that we are eternal students, and Pat touched on this. Mentorship is a two-way street. So I was wondering if you would share a piece of advice that you have each learned from a mentee of yours.
That's a good question.
That's a very good question.
I'll give a more general answer so you guys have time. No, that's right. I have found, one of the greatest rewards is bringing somebody up, seeing them do well, and having them do better than you. You really don't want to. Seeing them blossom, and so I have to tell you that I learn from every single one of these people. I watch them, I steal ideas from them, and the other thing is that I also find that a group is better than one or two people. So you get 4 or 5 in, and one gives an idea that's not just right, but it triggers something else in that person that gets there, and then you have the aha, and then you have the solution, which would have never happened on its own. And over again, it doesn't even matter on level, over and over again, that turns into successes. That's a general one.
I'm going to give a general answer as well. Sorry about that. But, my whole view on mentorship is this notion that, a great mentor is often a mirror to what your core strengths are. At least I see it that way, is that for many of us, we don't always know what we're good at, or what people perceive you to be good at. And so as a mentor, a lot of what you do is drawing out those strengths. I mean, Pat talked about it at the beginning, this notion of what differentiates you as a brand. And I don't know that any of us are so self-aware that we can fundamentally say, this is it, this is my differentiation. So for me, what I've got from mentees, and I confess I feel often I get a lot more from them than I necessarily give, but it's often that reflection. It's something that they've said, you should do more of this, or you should focus on this area, that was really valuable. And I sit there and go, wow, really? I had no idea. So it's often those small things where somebody will say something to you that was meaningful, and then you go away thinking about that and saying, okay, I hadn't realized that, and therefore it's something I should probably focus a bit more time on.
And a step further than that is when they criticize you, which is actually good, because talking about having a mirror, having somebody say, Joe, you're interrupting too much, or Joe, you're waiting too long to give me that feedback, and had I known that a month ago, I would have done better, and you always do that, you always delay. These are two real examples. But if you do it respectfully, a boss is happy. You're making that person better, and that happens often.
I had one of those moments a number of years ago with mentee that I really respected a lot, and still a very good friend. But we were in the middle of a crisis situation, and we were kind of dealing with things, and she pulled me aside and she said, I know you, and I know this is not the case, but when you really feel strongly about something, she said to me, you get intense and your face gets red and your volume of your voice goes up, and it sounds like you're yelling at me. And she said, I don't think you actually mean to be yelling at me, but you're a big guy. And when you're standing there and your voice goes up and your face is red, I think I'm in trouble. And that was like 24 years ago, and I that's still very much on my mind. You have to know how to dial yourself, and be careful that you're not sending signals you don't even really mean to send. Because remember that communication is only 10% about words. You can say the same words with different tone or different body language that would take completely different meaning. And I've always tried to keep that in mind. And I learned that from a young woman who well, then young, she's now old like me, but who was really helpful in that regard, and really with some criticism.
Yeah, I think it's a not so well kept secret that we need you as much as you may need us. Young people, I think, have the ability to reimagine the world as it should be, as opposed to how we see it. And so I find it really valuable to have people come and have disruptive thinking, and explain to us why the way that we do a certain thing may not even be the right approach, or we may not even be thinking about the right problem. And I benefited from this as a young person when I went early on in 2007 to work for the Obama campaign. You had all of these incredibly seasoned political operatives who were supporting Hillary Clinton, and we didn't have a chance. There was no chance that Barack Hussein Obama was going to be elected president. And we just thought that we'd reimagine a campaign as we thought it should be run, as opposed to how it had been done before. And that gave us a tremendous advantage because it allowed us to connect with people in a totally new way that felt fresh. And so I think in every profession, there is tremendous value in making sure that you as a young person go and connect with older people and help them to see a different way of doing things.
I think I saw a question over there.
I think kind of connecting a couple of the questions, especially about the research and of the information and Twitter and then the election. Something that I learned I'm not an American, but something that I learned from the election was that we were not expecting this, and we kind of were cheated by everything that we saw on social media and mainstream media. How do you think that would affect your businesses or your clients to know that maybe all of these channels are not telling you what you thought it was? Like, do you think that's going to affect a lot of your businesses?
Yes. Yeah, well, you know, there are things that happen in this election cycle that have been developing along anyway. You know, there've been, we have a thing we call evidence-based communication. So we want to always be basing our engagement on some idea of what a stakeholder group feels. But you've got to use all those tools the right way. And the fact is, somehow in this cycle, I think we got overly focused on a certain set of polling things in an era when polling is becoming more difficult. I'm going to guess you might not even use a landline, and you're probably not getting calls on your mobile phone with surveys, and so you may or may not click on something that's online. And I think there's a lot of the population that doesn't always get included in that. So you've got to find other ways. And I think Admar hit on it earlier, the value of analytics and of really looking at a range of tools. And I think it's more important than ever, but you've got to also read it the right way. And I think we all kind of lost that in this cycle here.
Well, if I expressed anything much further than that, I might begin to give away some of my political point of view. But I do think this was a very unusual election, because I think you did have such extremely different candidates. And I think while there was a polarization in terms of the left and the East Coast and West Coast, and then everything happened in the middle, but I think so many people were taken surprise as much by the fact that most of us thought that our current president-elect lied his way through the whole thing, that we couldn't but think that everybody shared that point of view. So I just think it was so different, because normally you've got a Republican and a Democrat, and they may have different ideologies or different points of view in politics, but this was so profoundly different to that. This was, somebody who was so experienced and so competent and so capable to do the job, and then someone who just kept saying whatever he thought everybody would want to hear. And I think that was probably the most shocking thing of all, is that there was such a large group of people who fundamentally believed that whatever he said was true. And he kept saying the polls were fantastic. And everybody was looking at polls and saying, what polls is he looking at? But it just seemed to feed into something that I think that's the piece that I want to spend more time trying to figure out. What did that feed into? Because it's something I really need to understand better, because I don't. And all the CEOs of the PR agencies, I don't know if you saw on PR Week, but yes. The day before, we all gave our prediction, and we all said that Hillary would win. So. I did. Yeah, you were in it too, yeah. And then I read it afterwards in the benefit of hindsight, and I wonder, were we all just expressing our political point of view, or because I was nervous for sure, but I still was 100. I thought it would be a landslide. I really did. I'm just.
Well, we underestimated also how angry people are and how bad of a time people had in the last 4, 8, 10, 15 years, who have basically been a bit desperate and said, I can go with more of the same, or I can roll the dice, even if I don't believe this person or love this person, or so on and so forth. And I think we all underestimated the depth of feeling with that group of people.
There's a great column today or yesterday. Sometimes with social media, you forget what day the things appeared. But by the president of the American Enterprise Institute, one of the think tanks in Washington. And he talked about how there's a lot of focus on the income gap. And what he said is it's actually what you need to take a look at is the dignity gap. What's happened is a lot of people either because of industrial jobs went away, or they lost their homes in the Great Recession, or whatever the recent setbacks are. And I, as coming from a big blue collar family, I can tell you I identified with this. Those jobs were part of their identity, and when they lost those, or if they're idle now, they feel like they've lost their dignity. And meanwhile, they perceive that there are a lot of other people that didn't pay any consequences. And I think that really drove something deeper, that whether it was intuitive or polling, I think Trump got that and pounded on it. And I think, you can't then just start talking about policy or text inversions or other, wonky things. I think what we all need to remember, and we know this from what we do, there's that emotional component is so important, and you've got to make that emotional connection. Right.
All right, we're going to wrap up for one-on-ones, but thanks again to all of our interviewees and our panelists. Everyone, one final round of applause. And then 1 second, Ron Culp is going to wrap up shortly, and then we'll get to do some one-on-ones.
Perfect. Thank you, Shante. I thought I'd better jump in before we start talking about religion. So how do you really feel? Anyway, thank you. An inspiring panel discussion, and I was also inspired by all of the students' questions. It's times like this, and I think for the last 3 years afterwards, I've told my wife that, okay, I am going to set up a PR agency, and I want from the University of Alabama, Jada, okay? I want from Loyola, Jacob. I want North Central's Andrea, IU, Northwest, Lori, and from DePaul, Shante, and our timekeeper, Lauren. And I am going to be so successful. I'm going to be sitting on this panel, okay? Thank you all, students, for participating. Thanks to the PRSSA chapter here at DePaul and their e-board for doing the logistical work and turnout. So I really appreciate that. Jim Motzer, who is your faculty advisor, had to leave for a personal issue, but he's a godsend to have at this university. Obviously, a couple of things that crossed my mind. Yeah, as you can tell, and my students will really tell you, I did away with weekly writing assignments, and we switched to Twitter. And they have to read something and tweet something every week, okay? Prad 5:30 if you want to see what they've been tweeting this week. And several of them are in the class, in this classroom today, and they've been tweeting away. So go back and check the Plank, hashtag Plank Mentor, and you're going to be following what was said not only here, as well as what is going to be said later. And the importance of it. Thank you, Pat Ford, for underscoring to everyone here with at Sunny Franks. Yeah. Her mind was blown, and that's what happens, and that's how you get noticed. And so that is something that each and every one of the students here should be aware of. And there are so many important things said here today, but I guess I'd have to close before we go into some one-on-ones. We're going to spread them out a little bit, so come up and meet them before I whisk them away at precisely 5:15. But I'd sum up with probably a comment that I try to live by, but sometimes I forget, and that is every day has to be a great day. And thanks to each and every one of you, today is a great day. Thank you all for coming. We'll now go one-on-ones. Thank you.